Good morning and welcome to the webinar this morning on dismissals for operational requirements. For those of you who have never attended a webinar of mine, my name is Nikki Hardwick. I am the Head of Human Resources at HRTorQue, and I will be facilitating the webinar today. Please feel free as we go through the webinar to post any questions in the Q&A. And I'm happy to answer them as we go through, or I can leave them to the end. It depends on the question. But the purpose of the webinar today is to try and unpack a little bit for you guys how retrenchments are supposed to work. And more specifically, so not necessarily the legislative steps, but the application of that. I find that when we go and assist clients with any kind of retrenchments, is very often it is done badly because people try and do it incorrectly. So what I mean by that is that what people will do is try to dismiss someone for operational requirements or retrench them because the person is not performing. Alternatively, people will want to downsize, but will have already selected people that they want to retrench. And so what happens is the process is done incorrectly and places the organization at a massive amount of risk. So, excuse me, although I will be going through some of the legislation, my intention today is to try and practically alert you through the legislation to some of the key things that you need to be aware of. So as I said, please feel free to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A, and as best as I can, I will answer them for you. So moving on, excuse me, okay. So when we have a look at operational requirements, many of you would have attended my other webinars on dismissals. And a key thing that most people need to be aware of, or at least what you should be looking at, is the code of good practice on dismissals. This is really, really important, and probably the thing that most people don't understand or get lost in is what are the requirements in terms of fair dismissal for the various different things. So for those of you who haven't attended any of the other webinars or have maybe missed some of them where I've referred to dismissal for incapacity or dismissal for poor performance, it is very important to understand that the requirements for a fair dismissal in each of those instances is different. So you cannot be dismissing someone who is possibly not performing and follow the retrenchment process, because if it does end up with CCMA, you're going to be in a situation where when procedure is tested, you're going to be found to be wanting because you followed the wrong process. The other alternative is, for example, people will be misconducting themselves. And so what an organization will do so that they don't have to deal with the process or the conflict is then just decide to retrench the person. I would always caution any business owner, any HR manager to be very careful about using retrenchment as an easy out when you want to, inverted commas, get rid of someone. You should always try and follow the correct process. So the process that I'm referring to today, as I've mentioned already, is specifically in relation to when we are as a business looking at restructuring. So I'll refer to dismissals. Just to be clear, when we talk about dismissals, I'm not necessarily referring to dismissal for misconduct. This is a dismissal or a termination of employment for operational reasons. So if we take a back step and we understand why do we as a company start looking at any kind of operational dismissals, is what we start to do is we do a strategic review of a business to decide how we're going to structure it. Okay, and what that really means is we're looking at a business to decide, not necessarily we don't have the money, but it could be that we need to restructure from an operational perspective to make things more streamlined. That might mean that we're looking at changing hours of work. It could be that we need to insource certain things or outsource certain things. It could be amalgamating certain positions. So as an example, you might have both a creditor's clerk as well as a debtor's clerk. And in the strategic review of the business, you've discovered that you actually don't need two positions, you only need one, an individual who is both able to do both creditors and debtors. So in that space, you're not necessarily saying that we're going to be retrenching because we don't have money, but you are retrenching because you don't need two positions. So this is a process, and when we go down retrenchments and you're starting to look at the reasons for retrenchments, what is very important is that when you are communicating with employees, you must at the start, or even prior to the start, you must understand why you're going down this road. Is it financial? Is it a restructure? Are you restructuring positions? What exactly is your intention in terms of that people structure? And why this is important is if, as an example, you go down the road and you issue letters to staff, and one of the reasons why you're doing a restructure is financial, there is an element, depending on the size of your business, where things like financials can be requested. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be given. They can request things like financials. We had a client once where they argued that they needed to retrench staff purely because of financial reasons. And during the retrenchment process, the MD arrived in a brand new Ferrari or whatever it was. And so that throws into complete disarray the process, because how can you be arguing that you don't have any money, but yet you as the MD or the CEO, whatever it is, can now purchase a brand new vehicle? So if it is not a financial thing, so you don't have the money, then you need to ensure that you are specifically stating why are you going through that process. So as I've mentioned in the second block there, it could be an inefficiency. We have too many people doing not enough work. It could be new kinds of technology. So as we move into, so since COVID, many things have changed where we had people on site in certain areas. Maybe we no longer have a need for those people in certain areas. So there's various different things. Then we move into when we decide what is the reason for the restructure. So why are we doing it? We then need to know that we have to follow certain guidelines. Now, just to go back to what I said before, often when we get involved in any kind of process like this, being a retrenchment process or dismissals for operational reasons, we will get involved where the person who we're dealing with has already pre-decided who they're going to retrench, and so they've already decided. When we then start to unpack the reasons behind it, there's no rhyme or reason other than the fact that I kind of know I need to do something. I'm not really sure. I think that we need to restructure because it seems inefficient, but I know that it's Nikki that's going to go. Now, if you're going to go into a retrenchment process like that, you are going to come short because you haven't followed the process. What is key to understand about processes with retrenchments is that there are two types of inverted commas retrenchment processes. The one is for a smaller retrenchment and the other one is for a larger retrenchment. The requirements for larger retrenchments are obviously much more in depth, and it's really important that when you, and I'll go through the rules now, when you're deciding what type of retrenchment, so before you can even have conversations, before you can issue letters, you need to decide on which side of the fence are you falling in terms of the process that you need to be following. Okay. So when we look at how legislation directs us and what we need to be doing, is we have to look at the various different pieces of legislation that will affect this particular process. So there's the Labour Relations Act, which refers to the dismissals for operational requirements. What are the processes that need to be followed? And then most importantly, well, possibly not most importantly, but I think it is quite important, is the Code of Good Practice on dismissals for operational requirements. As I've mentioned before, I think it's incredibly important that anybody who's possibly involved in restructuring and or dismissals of any kind need to understand what the requirements are for a fair dismissal. When tested at CCMA, what are you required to do to ensure that you're not falling foul of the law? So the Labour Relations Act will be very clear in section 189A or depending on which one you are, will be very clear in terms of what are the steps that need to be followed. But the Code of Good Practice also gives good guidelines in terms of how you're supposed to do that. And it also separates for you the difference between performance, misconduct, incapacity, and then operational requirements. The basic conditions of Employment Act will tell you what is required to be paid, or if you are part of a bargaining council, then that will obviously detail what you're required to pay in terms of a retrenchment package. Is it 1 week per completed year? Bargaining councils very often will have 2 weeks per completed year. So it's important to understand at what point do you give notice, at what point do you need to pay notice, how does it work? Is it 2 weeks? Is it 4 weeks? What are you required to be doing? And then, just as I said before, then industry collective agreements, if you do have one, you will need to follow that agreement. And if there's any common law as developed with decisions of the Labour Court. So we do talk about common law, going down a little bit in terms of bumping and what is required from that perspective. And also in terms of the reasons why we've decided to go for retrenchment, as well as the process that we're going to follow in terms of who we're going to choose. How do we decide on who we're going to choose also comes in based on various case law. So I'll talk about consulting parties, but you need to understand that in terms of a retrenchment process, these are the legislations that will come into effect. There's also, although it's not mentioned here, we also need to remember that in any retrenchment process, there's also the elements of a tax directive. And any sort of retrenchment package needs to, and it's the employer's responsibility to make application for that tax directive, not the employees. So any payment that needs to be made is you are required in the retrenchment process is to apply for a tax directive on the behalf of the employee before making the payment of that particular package to the employee. Okay, so if you haven't done that, you're then going to fall foul in terms of SARS. So that is one thing that I haven't mentioned on the slide, but you do need to include that as part of the process. Remembering that a mutual separation agreement is not the same as a voluntary retrenchment or a retrenchment. And so the rules in terms of a mutual separation and a tax directive are different to that of a voluntary or forced retrenchment. So there's specific rules in terms of SARS that you need to look at over there. So I'll talk into payment and that sort of thing at the end, but that's basically how the pieces of legislation that we need to look at. So I'm not going to go into, the specific requirements in terms of large scale versus smaller retrenchments. I'm actually going to talk more in terms of the idea of the process, regardless of whether you are doing large scale or not. Just remembering that in terms of large scale, there might be specific timeframes that you need to follow. For example, from the date of informing people that you're considering a retrenchment, you may have to wait 30 days. Also bear in mind that in terms of, bargaining council, there may be specific processes that you need to follow. You may have to notify the bargaining council. If there is a union that is there as a result of the bargaining council, you may have to notify them as well and wait a certain period of time. Sorry. So I'm going to be talking conceptually about the thought patterns that need to come into play when we as employers are starting to go down this road. So just in terms of the definition of a large scale is that when you are starting to retrench 10 employees, if you have less than 200 employees, 20 from, and there's the rules over there. This is listed in the Labour Relations Act in section 189A. So before you even start the process of retrenchment, you need to have a look at this to decide, is it a large-scale retrenchment or is it a small-scale retrenchment? There are other factors that come in. So there's obviously the number of employees that you need to look at based on your number of employees. Alternatively, you also then have a look at how many employees have been dismissed in the previous 12 months. So this is to get around an employer going 2 people this month, 4 people next month, maybe 6 people. So we kind of stay under 10 employees to get around the legislation. So there is an additional thing that says that if you have retrenched people in the last 12 months, they need to know how many and to ensure that it does not exceed this. Okay, and as I said, there are additional requirements in there. When we look at large-scale retrenchments, very often the use of CCMA becomes important, specifically to, get around a dispute. So in large scale, they'll often get, they'll request CCMA to come in and assist in the process. And there's various different things that you can do. You can use another body, but it becomes far more onerous when it's a large-scale retrenchment. If you go down the road of a large-scale retrenchment and you don't follow this process and it is then challenged at CCMA, you're going to have a problem because you haven't looked at what you need to look at. So if you're thinking about doing this, it's really important, if you don't know the legislation well, that you find someone, a consultant or someone who is skilled in this area to assist you. This is also especially important when you have unions involved, to ensure that the process is fair and also that you're engaging with the union on the right things. So you're doing the right things. You can't just get to the end and just decide that you're retrenching without beginning to discuss and consult. And we'll talk about the consultation process shortly. Now, just also remembering that we've got, Section 189 versus Section 189A. In terms of Section 189A, which is the large-scale retrenchments, employees then have the right to strike in an effort to dissuade the employer from retrenching. So there are certain rights that are given to employees under a large-scale retrenchment that are not necessarily given to employees in a small-scale retrenchment. So all of those things become important when you start to plan how we're going to go forward. So in any retrenchment, one of the key things that I say to any client that comes to me is that before you even have the first conversation, you needed to have processed and answered all the possible questions that there would be, so that when you get to the point of meeting with employees, whether it's large scale or small scale, it doesn't matter. You have thought about everything. You've thought about every eventuality. You've answered all those questions for yourself, as opposed to just deciding I'm going to terminate Nikki. I'm going to decide it's Charlene today, and then it's Candace. Those are my three people. We don't think about years of service. We don't think about why they're the people. We only think about them because currently they're in the role. And there's so many more things that you need to consider. Okay, so moving on. When we look at how do we select employees for retrenchment? Okay, so what are the selection criteria that's considered to be legally acceptable? Now, all of these things are encompassed within Section 189. And as you go through, it will tell you what is acceptable versus what is not acceptable. Sorry. But just in terms of the selection of employees. So if you're going to do a small scale retrenchment, again, what I find is the conversation that happens is people will say, we're going to be retrenching, it's 10 positions. It's these 10 positions. We know why we want to, get rid of those 10 positions, whether it be financial or whether it be, you just reorganizing the positions and the business flow. It doesn't really matter. What happens is we just automatically decide, one, I'm going to select the position because I don't really like the person. I'm going to select the position because the person really hasn't been performing very well for the last 5 years or whatever the case may be, or I select the person just because they happen to be currently sitting in that position. Now, that's a very, very bad way of going, because what you haven't done is applied your mind in terms of the ultimate requirements of the legislation. So when we look at, and you can have various different requirements for selecting employees. So the one is you can decide and you can agree upon a fair and objective criteria. Okay. The alternative is, so you can speak to staff, you can speak to the union, whatever it is, and you can agree upon the fair and objective criteria. So during the consultation process. So what that would mean is that you would have a conversation with everybody to say, we're currently considering, and that's a key thing. We never ever have a meeting with employees in the beginning to say we have decided. There's a number of things that must come. Even if you have decided, that's not what you will say to employees, because you need to consult with them first. So at the beginning, if you decide that you're going to go with agreement, you would have a meeting. For example, if you were talking to a union or a workers forum, what you would do is you would have a meeting with them to decide on what you believe those fair and objective criteria. In terms of the code of good practice, generally we would look at things like last in, first out, and that's often what is decided upon. It's a thing that is generally used, so last in, first out, or the person who has the least amount of experience. You could go length of service, skills and qualifications. You could start looking at things like retirement. There's a number of different things that you could look at to decide how do we go about selecting those people. If there's no agreement, which very often, especially in a smaller scale retrenchment, what you would do as the employer is to decide what are you going to decide. So as I said, it could be LIFO or it could be first in, first out. So depending on your long-term objectives, remembering if you're going to go last in, first out, depending on the number of positions, you could lose a number of younger, not that younger is necessarily better, but it's younger energy. So depending on the nature of your business, you might decide that you actually need the younger people with more energy, different ideas, better with technology, etc., etc., etc. And so FIFO, which is first in, first out, might work for you. The complexity with FIFO, though, is that those might be people that have been there for a number of years, and so the retrenchment packages would be much larger. You might decide that you don't want to go FIFO because you actually need the skill and you need the experience. So it's not just an automatic deciding that it's going to be last in, first out. You will need to look at what it is that you're planning on achieving to determine what is actually best for the business. So this is not a countrywide sort of everyone does this. You must consider in your business what actually works. So you could, for argument's sake, say there's, if we're looking at retrenching for financial reasons, the sales department may be exempt from that because the sales are the people that are going to generate sales. But the admin side of things might be the positions. Remember, we're not talking about people at this point, the positions that we're going to consider. And when we then look at bumping, for argument's sake, we might decide that we're looking at last in, first out and skills and experience or qualifications. So the sales positions remain. There might be people within the admin department that could easily move back into sales because they've been here longer, they've had the skills and experience, they've performed in the duty, whatever it is. And so we have positions available where people that have been here longer, if we're using last in, first out, that possibly could move across. So when we're thinking about the employees and the selection, the first thing you do, and it's probably not a good thing to do, is we're not selecting employees, we're selecting positions. So we decide which positions are not going to be done, and then we have our selection criteria. So in terms of Section 189, we look at either we agree, so we work into a process with the parties that we discuss with, we agree on the fair and objective criteria. We look at no agreement, and I give the criteria, and as I've said, the generally accepted ones is LIFO, length of service, skills and qualifications, and there's a number of other things that we could look at. So just going back to this slide, though, is very often we will also have companies that will want to use, for example, previous warnings. We could also use performance as something that we could consider. Those, I would always caution a organization to use that as one of the selection criteria if your process has not been good. So if you don't apply it fairly across the board, especially when we're looking at performance, so we'll get to the point that we're deciding on retrenchments, and it's a really, really easy way out to get rid of the people that, have really not been performing over the last X amount of time. And so this is a perfect opportunity for me to just get rid of the dead wood. Now, the problem there is that if I'm going to take performance into account, I need to have records that adequately show that I have been managing the performance over this amount of time. I also need to be able to answer questions. If I choose Nikki and say, well, Nikki, we're using performance as one of the criteria, where you have over the last 2 years just, not performed adequately at all. My question to you will be, have you done this with everybody else? Do you have, the process? I've never seen it being done with anybody else. You need to be able to answer the questions to say, yes, we actually have. Here's our process. I have evidence. And if it's ever questioned in CCMA, you have the ability to say, this is an established process. I'm very happy to confirm that here we go. Here is my evidence as to why Nikki was the chosen one and not somebody else. The same applies for things like discipline. If you're going to take into account disciplinary records, please make sure that that it is applied fairly across the board, so that if you are questioned, that you're not just using retrenchment as an easy way out to get rid of people that you don't really want. Okay. So my sense is to say most instances, the best ones to use is last in, first out. You use skills and qualifications. Length of service is also a good one. Key aspect here is that you cannot, very clearly, you cannot use, and it's categorically stated, you cannot use salary as a criteria to select people. If a person, inverted commas, is earning too much money, you cannot use the retrenchment process as a way to rectify salaries. It is not acceptable, and it cannot be used as a criteria to resolve that situation. If you want to change salaries, what you can do is you can begin a process, which is a completely separate process, to negotiate changes in terms and conditions. You also can't, for argument's sake, use this process to force a change in hours of work. So I can't say to you, well, look, we need to change hours of work. We want to pay everybody less. So either change or I'm going to retrench you. There is a process where you can go about and negotiating changes, but you cannot give people the ultimatum, take this or else. There needs to be a process prior to this where you're talking to staff about possible changes in terms and conditions, but you cannot amalgamate these two processes together. So this can't be a threat to accept or be retrenched. Okay. All righty. Okay. So remembering when we begin the process of considering retrenchments, the key word here is that we're still considering. So until we've gone through the whole process, no final decisions have been made. We need to, as the company, whether you're small or large, you still need to go through the process, and the time frame, if it's a small scale retrenchment, could be a lot smaller. There is obviously the elements of voluntary retrenchment, which could be one of the selection criteria. So you could offer people voluntary retrenchments to leave of their own fruition. But before you, and this is one of the questions that need to be answered, is before we've decided the only option that we can go to here is that of retrenchment, we have an obligation to consider other alternatives. This is not to say that you have to do the other alternatives and that each of these is going to apply to you. You do need to, before you just decide on retrenchments, have thought about various different things. Remembering that the obligation of employers here is to try, above all, to not have to go down the road of retrenchment. And the questions that are going to be asked, if it's ever challenged at CCMA, is one is process that they're going to be looking at, and two, did you apply your mind? So as I said before, one of the things that we need to do is we need to consult with employees. And if you haven't applied your mind and considered all these things, there has to be an exercise beforehand where you have considered these things, so that if you are questioned, whether it be by a union, whether it be by a workplace forum, or whether it just be by employees, is if they position with you, you said that you're going to do a retrenchment, have you not considered this? You need to be able to have the answer. Now, where the challenge comes in is if your decision to retrench someone is based on something other than a calculated process, decision-making process, you're going to be stuck without an answer. So as an example, I decide that I'm going to retrench Nikki because I don't really need a head of HR. And actually, the real reason I'm retrenching Nikki is because I don't think she's been performing. She maybe costs me too much money. She's got benefits that I don't really want to give her. And so this is an easy way out. And so what happens is I start the process with Nikki. I tell her the terrible news. Nikki, we're considering retrenchment. So, sorry, but this is the end of the road. I tell Nikki, listen, go away, think about it. Let us know if you have anything that you think we could do differently. And so what I do is I do a little bit of research. I come back and I say, listen, I don't really want to be retrenched. But you do know that there are X amount of other positions within the HR department that I'm more than skilled to do. So I've also been here the longest. And so what I want to do is I want to consider, is there not another position that I can take? I'm actually also happy with a decrease in salary if I can keep a job, not necessarily my job. Or alternatively, I say, listen, what I'm happy to do if I need to is I'm happy to, I don't know, work half day. I'm happy to whatever. I come up with all these alternatives, which are actually reasonable and valid alternatives, but you have no answer for, because your main objective was actually just to circumvent the process and pick Nikki because it was Nikki and you wanted to get rid of her. Okay. So when we start the process, the first step is to think about why we're doing what we're doing. What is the actual reason? Then we move into the next step, which is to identify what positions, forget about the people, what positions we no longer need. Are we amalgamating positions? Are we, closing down a particular department, whatever the story is? If we're amalgamating positions, are we bringing these two positions together? What skills are required in those positions? This particular, department that we have in East London, who's going to be doing that job? No, we're moving it to Durban. Can we move any of the people from East London to Durban? If we look at that, what are the different alternatives that we have available? What are the skills that are needed? So we now know at the beginning, before we start to look at alternatives, we know what it is that we're looking at. Once we've then looked at that, we then start to look at, is there anything else we can do before we get to this process of, looking at what it is that we want to do? And possibly the two may be done in conjunction to each other. But my point is here is that before we even meet with the employees, we need to have gone through this process to be able to answer any questions. This then says to the employees and subsequently bargaining council or CCMA that you've actually applied your mind. So the kinds of things that you can consider before retrenchment. Remember, as I said before, retrenchment is the final thing, your only alternative. There is nothing else other than retrenchments. As we look at things to increase productivity, which is not always an option. You could look at short time. So short time is a measure before retrenchment, looking at costs and expenditure, reducing numbers of contractors or casual laborers, using employees to perform functions performed by the contractors or laborers, outsourcing. And there is an element here with skills development, which actually works through CCMA. There is I'm going to call it a skills development program in which you can approach CCMA to say, what we would like to do is for the employees to be upskilled so that they can move into different positions. My experience with this is it is quite a difficult process, and I have yet to be successful in getting it to move forward. But some of the unions do make a request that you you approach CCMA to ask for this as an option so that the employees possibly may not be able to move into different positions within the business, but it is a possibility. But they develop additional skills and so are a little bit more marketable when they go out elsewhere. So that is something that is not necessarily brought up by employees, but could be brought up by the union. And then there are voluntary retrenchment packages. So that is where you offer employees within the business the option of walking away. So they almost sacrifice themselves for the better good. The challenge with a voluntary retrenchment is that one, it's going to cost you a little bit more. So what you do is you say to everybody, under a normal retrenchment, the package is, for argument's sake, 1 week per completed year, your leave and a month's notice. If you choose the voluntary retrenchment package, we're going to give you 2 weeks per completed year, and then your leave and 2 months notice for whatever it is that you want to do. The challenge with the voluntary retrenchment is that you can't really you need to be very careful about the rules for who can apply for this. So you may not, so what may happen is people who you don't really want to leave may end up taking the voluntary retrenchment or opting for it. And so when you decide to offer voluntary retrenchment packages, you need to be very specific about the rules, about who can apply and who cannot apply, for argument's sake. You also need to be careful that it doesn't appear that what you're doing is aligning the voluntary retrenchments again to encourage those that you don't really want to leave. So this is something that you can do, but again, apply your mind to what is actually the outcome. Worst case scenario, if all the people that I need to stay, those that have years of experience, I don't know, specific skills, if they take the voluntary retrenchment. So as an example, if you've got someone who is the only, not a very good, only skilled person in a particular, I don't know, machine, particular, whatever it may be, you may end up saying to that person that they don't have an option to go because it is a scarce skill that you need to retain in the business. You could, as an example, in, I don't know, sales, I don't know, maybe it's very specific. You could say sales cannot take a retrenchment package. It could be that the directors can't, or whatever the story may be. But you have to be very careful. Don't just do a blanket thing where anybody who, you can do a blanket thing for voluntary retrenchments, but understand what the consequences are if you do put that forward. Just to understand as well is that what you can do is if you have a position, if you have a position in which you have considered the various different alternatives, you know that, for example, there is no other position that the person can take. You've considered all the various alternatives. They can't move. You can't do short time, etc., etc. You can very carefully approach the person. That you still need to go through the process of retrenchment, but it can be shortened to say, we have this particular position, let's just say it's the cleaner. We no longer need a cleaner because we have far less staff, and so you can't move anywhere else. We don't need short time, etc., etc. We can't take things away. We can approach the person and in a without prejudice discussion, discuss a voluntary retrenchment package. The nature of the beast is that it is voluntary, so the person may decide to not take the voluntary retrenchment and decide to go through the entire process, which is considering alternatives, having the ability to come up with their alternatives to be considered, and a process that would go through. If they decided not to go voluntary, the sweetener of the more money, etc., might go away. But you need to be careful in, bigger retrenchments, not necessarily large-scale retrenchments, of selecting choice people for voluntary retrenchments. You just need to be careful of how you do it when it's a number of people that you're looking at approaching. Okay. As I said, if you guys have got any questions, please post it in the group. So often we will have, discussions, arguments, heated debates about the consultation process within the retrenchment process. Now, if you read the Labour Relations Act, the purpose of a retrenchment consultative process is that we are seeking to get consensus. Okay, it does not necessarily mean that we will reach consensus. So what that really means is that when we are talking about having consultations with staff, I may go through a process with the staff in which they come back and say, I have considered the following alternatives. Can you go away and you think about things that possibly I have not considered? Tell me if there is anything that you think that I could do differently, or is there an idea that you have? Employee comes back and, I don't know, poses an idea. which, let's just say, the person decides that they will work half day for half the money. We may end up considering that and say, unfortunately, the nature of the position is that we need a full-day person. So unfortunately, your alternative doesn't suit us in this instance, and we can consider nothing else. So we've looked at all the alternatives, and we have no other alternative but to consider, not to consider, but to make a decision that position is redundant, and now so are you. Okay, so you are now being retrenched. The person doesn't have to necessarily agree with our decision. You ultimately, as the employer, make the final decision to say, I've decided that the retrenchment process is over and you are now being terminated. If you don't agree, it doesn't mean that you can't proceed. Often where the process is stalled is that people don't understand, well, what am I as the employer supposed to go through to decide? So they don't consult properly, they don't consider all the alternatives. So when we get to a meeting where people go, have you considered X, Y, and Z? A good example is, in your letter, you have now said that this is a financial thing. I'm a little bit confused because the director has now bought a new vehicle and has gone on a 6-week holiday to wherever. Okay, I'm confused as why you're saying it is financial when all of these things are happening. We've just had bonuses, we've all got a 10% increase, whatever. Your argument is not making any sense. And so in that space, what happens is people now start to ask questions, and then you can't give a valid and reasonable answer. Thanks, Darren. I'll answer your query about short time shortly. So when we go through the process, if you've done your homework up front, if you have considered everything, not with the view of trying to short-circuit the system, trying to meet another objective other than retrenchment, then you should be fine in this process. That's not to say that when you're meeting with workplace forums or unions that it's not going to be difficult, but you don't need to get consensus. Bearing in mind that even if you go down the road where you haven't got consensus, people are upset, they've now been retrenched, they are still allowed to refer the matter to CCMA, so that CCMA can decide whether or not they agree with your process. Do they agree that your procedure was right, and do they agree that your decision-making, your thought pattern was fair and justified? Okay, so just to reiterate again, when you're going down this process, don't try and hide behind retrenchments to fire people or dismiss people for misconduct, performance, or incapacity. You're on a road to nowhere, and it isn't a good idea. Okay. So when we look at the different things that we start to go into consensus seeking, and this really goes into the measures that we would put in place is to, ideally, as we want to avoid as many dismissals as we can. This is based on labor relations, to minimize the number of dismissals, change the timing, look at the adverse effects. So when we go through what is required in the letter and what the organization is supposed to do, is these are all the things that we start to discuss. Okay, when we're looking at what are the two parties need to try and do. Okay, so Darren, you asked about short time. Okay, so short time, so basically with short time, oh, sorry, I'll read out the question. So I don't know if everyone can see it. So basically, Darren has said, how do we implement short time and the guidelines and requirements for doing so? So in terms of short time is, so depending on whether you're covered by a bargaining council or it is, basic conditions, what you would really need to do, if you're bargaining council, it's really important that you look at the rules of the bargaining council. There's very specific steps and a lot of the bargaining councils of exactly what it is that you have to do. If there is no bargaining council, then what you can do is you can have a policy that really dictates how do you do short time. So generally the policy will say, for argument's sake, we can give you notice you know, 4 hours notice? What happens if you come to work on the day? Do we pay you for the day? So it's actually a policy-based decision based on the elements of the Labour Relations Act in terms of when notice must be given, how long does short time last, what is the payment for short time during that time. Another key question in terms of short time is, what do you pay when the person goes on annual leave? Are you paying the short time payments, or are you paying the full-time payments? So, you know, obviously it would not be a good idea to pay a full-time payment and a short time, because then everybody would go on leave and, you know, get their full money. So when you're looking at short time, the best thing to do firstly is to decide how it's going to be implemented. What are the time frames that you're going to do it? Remembering that short time is a short-term you know, fix, hopefully, to get you through a bad patch. If you are starting to do short time where you're inherently changing terms and conditions, so you went from a 45 a week employee to a 20-hour a week, at that point you now need to go into possibly the dismissals for operational requirements. You cannot change terms and conditions by using short time. So we have a policy that says if we're going to implement short time, we must notify you the day before. We must tell you how long it's going to last for. We must tell you when we will tell you that it's now changing, what positions are affected, and that's basically how you go about doing it. Okay, so those are really the guidelines. I can send you some guidelines after the meeting, but it is quite important that you do look at the various pieces of legislation to understand, one, how does it impact in terms of your business requirements. The office environment will be very different to manufacturing. So you need to look at it specifically in terms of different departments, different types of positions, who is affected, because not every position is necessarily going to be affected by short time. Your salespeople, and I keep using that because it's a good example, sales may not necessarily be, you know, impacted by the short time. Okay, Cecilia has another question. Can an employee go to CCMA if they've accepted a voluntary separation or voluntary retrenchment? Yes. So there is no, so you can have in the agreement that it is in full and final settlement. So, and it's very important that you do have that in there. The challenge with any kind of voluntary, where you're looking at mutual separation, voluntary retrenchment, is what happens is the person, what they're challenging actually at that point is they're challenging the signing of the agreement. So you may end up having a conversation saying, do you want to accept this? You don't have to. They go home, they think about it, they look at the money, they think that's wonderful. And then what happens is 3 weeks, a month down the line, they now have a change of heart and they decide that what happened was really unfair. They refer the matter to CCMA and they then start to say things like, I was forced into it, I didn't really understand what I was reading, etc., etc. And so now it's up to the CCMA to decide, was the person forced into it? So it's not about necessarily the process or your justifications for it. It would be more about, how did this get signed? So if you are going to go down the road of any kind of voluntary retrenchment or voluntary separation, it is really important that you allow the person the opportunity to consider. So I would never ever say, here, Nikki, we're sitting in a meeting. In this meeting, make a decision. Even if Nikki decides in that meeting to make a decision, I would almost force the person to go home, take 24 hours, 48 hours to think about the agreement. I would give them a copy of the agreement, consult with anybody, give them time to look at the agreement and to come back with any questions. After the time frame, they must then let me know if they're happy to sign the agreement or not. That way, if you do end up going to CCMA, you have the ability to say, I didn't force Nikki to sign the agreement. I didn't call her into a meeting and threaten her. I actually gave her time where she could go home and think about it and consult. She spent 2 days thinking about it. She never came back with questions, or she did come back with questions, etc., etc. And then she signed the agreement. And in fact, she emailed the agreement, signed agreement through to me. That is not a case where You didn't have the opportunity to decide. You didn't have the opportunity to consult or ask any questions. So I think it's just the process. Yes, anyone can take you to CCMA, and CCMA will then, or Marketing Council will then decide whether or not they think you behaved fairly. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to the next slide. I see that we do have a couple of other questions, but I just want to go into some of the slides and then I'll answer some of the questions at the end. All right, so going more into the alternatives. So these are just examples which, we can go into the different kinds of alternatives. So stopping overtime or Sunday work, paying fewer hours of overtime. And again, my suggestion is at the beginning, when you're considering why are we deciding this, you need to look at all of these things. So you need to, all of these things you need to consider. Now, again, over here, I want to mention, so it does say here, reducing wages. Okay. Now, when we're looking at reducing wages, so if I look at people that are possibly being overpaid, what I need to do, so this is reducing kind of wages or remuneration needs to be a process that happens before we even start speaking of retrenchments. So at that point, what I would do is I would sit with the staff. I would say, guys, and I would obviously give information, our wage bill is incredibly high. We're not making enough money. We have a huge problem and we would like to consult about reducing wages. I don't know, the amount of money we give to medical aid, whatever it may be, we need to reduce our overheads. Can we consult with you and by agreement reduce it? If everybody turns around, because remember, we cannot change terms and conditions without somebody's approval. If we get to the end, and I'm talking very globally, guys, there is obviously a process. If we get to the end and everybody turns around and says, no, I refuse to have my medical aid taken away, my pension fund, I want my 70 days of annual leave, etc., etc., I refuse to change. What we then do as part of the retrenchment consideration, so when we're looking at why we're doing it, one of the reasons would be is that we actually can't afford it. So we tried that as an alternative. We asked them, they said no. We have now no alternative. We've thought about it. We've asked you, you said no. So now it's not an alternative. Be going accept or else. We asked you without any threats of retrenchment. We asked you, you said no. We explained that you didn't want to do it. And so now I get into the point where I say I have no alternative because there isn't anything else. I can no longer afford to do this and this and this and this. And so I now need to consider retrenchments and redundancies. And so these are the kinds of things that you can start to do. There's obviously things here, for example, here, the natural turnover. If you've got an urgent situation where you need to decide to retrench staff, that may not be an option. All of these things here are not a have to consider. These are things that you can consider to try and avoid having a retrenchment. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. Then we talk about bumping. So there is the case law there, which I'm not going to go into. But one of the key things that everybody should really consider when we look at, who are we picking, okay? And again, you need to do this before you even meet with staff. So what would happen is as an example, I would say, let's assume I am the creditors clerk, okay? I have now decided that I don't, in the organization, they've decided that they don't need both a creditors clerk as well as a debtors clerk. They need an accounts clerk, and the accounts clerk, because I've already thought about this, needs an diploma, 5 years experience, whatever it may be. When I then look at Nikki, in terms of last in, first out, Nikki was not, so Nikki was actually last in. And so Charlene, who was been here longer, get first dibs at the new position. So we go to Charlene, we say, we don't have this. This is a new position. Would you like it? Charlene says, yes, please. So now I say to Nikki, this is what has happened. I don't have a position for you. Okay, but I have considered your skills and experience. And Nikki, you actually came from reception. You have the skills, you have the experience. Reception has actually only been here a year, whereas you've been here 4 years. I can offer you the position of reception, i.e. I'm bumping. Would you like to take it? I do need to tell you, Nikki, that unfortunately, if you do take that position, there is a bit of a drop in salary, or the hours have changed, or whatever. Would you like to? Would you like to take the position? As Nikki, I can then decide, actually, I don't want to take the position. I can't afford it. I don't want to go back to reception. And so I then say to you, I actually don't want to do that. If I do want to do it, so now Nikki says, yes, please, I'll do it. So Nikki's now going to go to reception. Now we look at Candace. So as you can see, the position that was actually affected was the creditors and the debtors clerk, which was amalgamated. If I hadn't thought about these things, I would have just chosen Nikki and said, be done. If I didn't want Charlene because she was annoying, I would have said, okay, well, Charlene, thanks very much, off you go. Now, who was never, ever considered as a person, I now have a meeting with Candace to say, Candace, this is actually what's happened. So there you sit. When I look around the organization, do you have the skills and experience as well as the service to be selected for anything else? Unfortunately, we don't have any other positions. So we've considered this, we've considered this, we've considered all of these things. And so unfortunately, you need to go. Remembering that was, and obviously we don't say it in those words, but remembering that we can do both vertical as well as horizontal bumping. But when you consider retrenchments, at the beginning, don't consider people, consider positions and what you require. Then we look at the people and the positions. We start to move it almost like a chessboard to decide where people are going to go. So that when you have the final conversations, you have thought about everything, you've considered everything. Okay. All right. Then we have a look at, now I'm talking about a very short process. If we're going to a large scale retrenchment, please remember that may take longer. So there are elements within the Labour Relations Act that require you to wait a certain amount of time. Assuming that's not the case, once we have done all the work that I've done, what we would then do in terms of process, and remember, as I said before, we're talking about proposed. So when we have the first conversations with people, we would have a meeting with the affected employees. Okay, and affected is not necessarily everybody, but it could be anybody. So in my scenario, the creditors, so Charlene, Nikki, and Candace, all of those employees are affected, even though the position and reception is not. All of those people, I would have a meeting with the affected employees. I would explain my rationale and why they are affected. I would explain what process I've gone through, what I have considered, what will work, what won't work, and basically why I've ended in this particular situation. I will then give them the formal notice of consultation. Now, that is a really important letter. So in as much as you can have a discussion, you do need to give them that first letter of consultation. And there's actually specific things that need to go in there, one of which is that we end up retrenching, how much do you get paid? What is the, the rationale that I've used? What are the selection criteria? What is the time frame that we're going to be working over? So if we consult now, when am I expecting the process to finish? And if I do issue notice of termination, when is that going to happen? So all of those things need to be in the letter. So as soon as send them the letters, and what I say to them is I want them to go away and to think about what I have said, what my rationale is, and for them to think about if they have any other ideas. Do they, I don't know, whatever it is, do they think of anything that I possibly haven't? So I've already given you examples of where Nikki might go, hang on, you've picked me, but I think I can do reception. If you've already given them those alternatives and explained why it won't work, then they have, you've already shown them that you've considered it and that you haven't necessarily just made a rash decision. Then you would have a follow-up meeting on the Wednesday. So you can do 48 hours, you can do a bit longer. The main objective here is that what you need to do is to give people enough time to think about it. What you're basically doing is saying to them, think about why I shouldn't retrench you. And so you have to give them enough time. You can't give them an hour. And that will come into question if we get to CCMA or bargaining council for the person to go, well, hang on, this wasn't a consultative process because they rushed me through it and I had no idea what was going on. And they made me sign documents and here I sit. So even in the second meeting or in the first meeting is when you say to them, we want to meet again on Wednesday. If during that time you feel like there's not enough time, obviously we've got to be careful of people just pushing it out. Please let me know if you would like to delay it by a day. So what you're showing them is not necessarily we're delaying it by weeks and weeks and weeks, but you're open to them having more time. It's a very stressful time. They need the time to think, speak to someone, get advice from an advisor, you know, etc. So at the second meeting, they will then provide you with feedback in terms of what they considered. That could be, thought about everything, I actually have nothing to give you, okay? Or they will then come in and say, well, actually, yes, why can't I relocate to Joburg? Come with alternatives, you'll document the alternatives, you'll consider them. Again, we go to Thursday. Depending on what the alternatives are, you will take the appropriate time to consider those. Don't take too little time because then it appears that you haven't considered it. So come with alternatives, you will consider it. Will it work or won't it work? And then on the next meeting is you will then provide feedback. You have considered all the alternatives. You may end up having a third meeting. This is just a example. You may end up having a third meeting or a fourth meeting, depending on how it works within your environment and depending on what feedback is given by the employees. What will eventually happen when there are no alternatives and everything has happened, you will then get to the point where you say, well, we've considered everything. We have no other alternative. So now we've spoken about the proposed decision to look at retrenchments. We have nothing else. We can't, we've thought of everything. We've given you an opportunity. And so unfortunately, a decision has been made that we have to retrench. We've gone through the process, you're the person, and then you issue the final letters, which is to say a decision has been made and unfortunately you will be retrenched, and you give them the time frames. Okay, so that is sort of the time frame, and not the time frame, but the process that you must follow. Please just bear in mind that I've given you a broad sort of overview. You have to take into account what is happening within the organization. If people are asking for more time, if it appears to be more complicated, don't stick with the 48 hours or whatever. You need to use your own discretion to decide. And the main thing is to say, if somebody challenges this at CCMA, will I be comfortable to stand up and say, believe that I was fair because I did the following? Okay, so that's really what your line in the sand is. Alrighty, so as I spoke about in the first meeting, you need to do a letter. So the content of the letter is described for you in section 189(3) of the Labour Relations Act. And it is a very specific letter. You cannot just give a letter saying we're considering dismissal. You need to include the reasons for the proposed dismissal. So what have we decided? What alternatives you have looked at, okay, before considering the dismissals. Remembering at this point, the letter is saying we are contemplating this. We haven't decided yet. So what are the reasons? What are the alternatives? What are the number of employees likely to be affected in the job categories? The proposed method for selecting them, when we're going to be doing it, what is the time frame? What is the severance pay? What assistance could we possibly be offering? Possibility of future re-employment. So that's a big question that often comes up, is people will say, do we have to re-employ the people if we've terminated them for retrenchment? So the answer is no. What you do need to do is to give a time frame that says, if the positions come available within, let's say, 6 months, we will advise you, and you have the ability to apply for the position. You may have an added advantage because you were here, but you will be in the running for that position. You also have to say the number of employees that are employed by the employer. So this is to decide whether it's large or small scale retrenchments, and then how many people were retrenched in at least dismissed for operational requirements in the preceding 12 months. So that is really to try and understand, is it large or small scale? Okay. What do we pay? So just for those of you who don't know, so in terms of the final pay for retrenchment, is you need to pay a severance pay, which is 1 week per completed year of service, any outstanding annual leave, so you have to pay annual leave, Notice paid. So if notice is not worked, then you must pay the notice as if it was worked. Remembering with the retrenchment, you may decide to let people go and any other statutory or contractual payments, including pro rata and ex gratia payments. Guys, please remember, as I said in the beginning, if you're going through retrenchments, you as the employer have the obligation to do a tax directive. It is not the obligation of the employee to sort that out themselves, sort it out themselves. What you also need to do is you wait for the tax directive to determine how much tax is supposed to be deducted off the person's package. They cannot be, well, not necessarily, depending on the tax directive, is it's not for you to decide the tax, it's for SARS to decide, and then you only pay thereafter. Okay. How do we then finalize the process? So we determine the actual exit date. As I said before, the exit date could be prior. You may not require them to work their, their full time. You may require that they do. You calculate the package based on the tax directive. And then you need to give them, for example, you need to give them a certificate of service. You need to give them their UR19. And although it's not legislated anywhere, I would highly recommend that you give people the salary schedule for UIF purposes, just because we do know that anybody who's going to UIF now is being sent back by UIF for the salary schedule. And normally that has to go back 4 years. And I think it's related to the system that UIF has is not updated. Okay. And I sped through the last couple of slides that I could answer any questions. So for those of you who don't want to stay on, you're more than welcome to go. Thank you for joining me for the session. For those of you who have questions, I'm going to answer them now. And then Charlene will share the slides with everybody after the session. Thank you for joining me, and I'm going to move into some of the questions that we have posted now. Okay, so we have a question relating to if the company has gone through a Section 197 and it's now past 12 months, but there's a particular employee who's in the process of being retrenched, making reference to previous company policy of 3 weeks, okay, and now we're offering 1 week. Which company policy would apply here? Okay, so if it's gone past 12 months that that person has been in the new company, I would say specifically because it's relating to a retrenchment process and not a current condition of employment, I would say the new company policy would apply. It's now moved past the 12 months. The old policy doesn't apply. It doesn't automatically come in. I would feel, and I may need to chat to you in a little bit more detail, but I think you would have a fair reason outside of the 12 months that you would have a justified reason to use the new company policy in terms of retrenchment. So yes, so that's the answer to that one. Let me have a look. New questions here. Okay, hold on 1 second. Okay, we've got a couple of questions. Okay, so we've got one from Bev. The company revenue and size is reduced significantly and no longer requires a human resource manager at the current level. Current HR manager is willing to take retrenchment to allow less expensive HR person to be employed to better fit the company profile and strategy. Is this acceptable? So in any sort of engagement between employer and employee, if the person is accepting of a change, then yes, it's acceptable. So even if my employer approaches me and says, Nikki, we can't afford you, and I say, well, I'll take a drop in salary, that is an accepted change. I've agreed to it. There is no issue. There's no negotiation. We've spoken about it. It's agreed. The only thing is I would put it in writing and make sure that it is signed. Okay, next question. Okay, is the employer required to specify the proposed retrenchments, especially what governs an enhanced severance package? So yes, so if you're going to offer a voluntary retrenchment, and that's what I assume you're referring to, you do need to, in the first letter of consultation, especially if you're looking at voluntary, is, and when you're discussing voluntary, is to explain to people voluntary equals that. And normal, if you want to call it that, equals that. So you do need to specify what the difference is. And the reason being is you're trying to encourage people to leave of their own free will, if you want to call it that. So yes, okay. Regarding severance pay, if an employee has worked for 2 years and 10 months, okay, so do we include the 10 months or do we only include the 2 years in the calculation? So conditions is very clear. It is per completed year. So if you haven't completed the year, you do not need to include it. Very often people will make a judgment call. So you could have someone that's been there 4 years and 11 months. They may elect to round it up. If you are going to round it up, then I would just be clear with the employee that rounding up is almost, I want to say, ex gratia. So we've given you something in addition to. Okay, but you legally don't have to because it refers to completed year. Okay, and then Cecilia's last question here. If an employee disputes his, that's an interesting one. If an employee disputes his start date, as the new trustees have taken over, and they don't have a contract of employment, what do we do? So I think the question would be is what is the difference between the start date of what the trustees believe and what the employee believes? If we're talking about a year, it may be a difference of a week. If we're talking about 5 years, then it's 5 weeks. Then, you know, I would try and go back to as much evidence as you have, possibly if there are inverted commas weaknesses, you know, any of that sort of thing to try and confirm your points of view. If you have nothing, then I would try and negotiate something with the employee as to an agreed start date. But I would also decide, what does that look like? How long are we talking? Are we talking about 1 week? Are we talking about 7 weeks? What is the difference? Especially if it's if it's a lengthy period of time, there may be people that are able to give you information in terms of confirming that the person was actually here 7 years before the trustees believe so. Okay, one last question, I think. Can an employee claim UIF with a voluntary retrenchment? That's a really good question. So yes, with a voluntary retrenchment, an employee can claim. There are some forms that need to be completed, which the employer actually confirms that the person was retrenched in a voluntary retrenchment as part of the entire retrenchment process. Where you're not allowed to claim for UIF is if we do a mutual separation. So mutual separation, basically the way the Department of Labour see it is that I have been approached and given 2 alternatives. One, have a disciplinary hearing, take your chances, fight your case. You may win, you may not win, but there it is. Alternatively, take a mutual separation in which you can walk away with some money. Department of Labour said you had the right to fight your case, and if you were dismissed, you could then go claim from your own. You have actually chosen to walk away and get some money. So mutual separation, they deem that almost a resignation. You've decided to walk away. The voluntary retrenchment, however, is you are, the argument is that somebody was going to go by virtue of retrenchment, whether it was you deciding to fall on your sword for your co-workers and deciding to walk away so that someone else didn't. You have done that for someone else. If it wasn't going to be you, it was going to be someone else. And so they're happy to pay UIF in that regard. Okay. Oh, there's another question in the chat function. Let me get there. Just loading it. Hold on. Okay, let me just have a look. Okay, Joseph. So if we decide to buy a company and only need 625, okay, so if you're buying a company, you need to consider, so that is a bit more complicated because if you're taking over a business, that is possibly a Section 197 transfer. So, and what that really means is you're taking over a business in its entirety. It is actually the same business, it's just owned by someone else. There are very specific rules in terms of retrenching, etc. So you need to refer to Section 197 of the Labour Relations Act. And one of the main things of buying another business with current staff is that you cannot just retrench staff. You can't just, as part of that process, there is an obligation of the new business owner to take those staff over. old business owner needs to resolve it before the process happens. Key to that as well is what you need to think about in terms of a Section 197 transfer. Does the leave carry over? Does the service carry over? So as an example, if you've got people that have been there 30 years, does the old business owner pay out that service and it starts anew with you? But you need to be very careful. You cannot use a retrenchment process in a Section 197 transfer. Please read that section before you, it's actually part of the business agreement between old owner and new owner. You're more than welcome to email me if you're unclear. Don't go on retrenchments in a transfer of business like that. How much notice pay do you have to pay out? So that would depend on the basic conditions, and basic conditions says that if you've been with me for less than 6 months, it's 1 week. 6 months to a year, it's 2 weeks. Anything more than that is 4 weeks. But you need to refer back to your contract, because if your contract is different, it can't be less than basic conditions. But if your contract is different, for argument's sake, if it says a calendar month, then you are bound by your contract. If it is different and more than, so more beneficial than basic conditions. So you're just going back over here. So when you're looking at what you need to pay out here, these are the specific sections that you would need to refer to in terms of how much notice you need to pay. Okay. I think that's the last of the questions. I don't think anyone else has any more questions. If you would like to, you're more than welcome to email us. If you need assistance with any retrenchment process, even if it's thinking about your thought pattern, are you thinking about all the things? Have you considered everything that you should have considered? Please feel free to email us at hra@hrtorq.co.za, or give us a call. We're happy to help you either with Section 197 transfers or retrenchments. Thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the session. We will be emailing you afterwards, and we will chat soon. Thanks, everyone.